On the night of January the 6th, 1888, when the wind reached 60 miles in the hour and drove ice grains hard enough to mark paint, the lantern over Glenn Mercer's roof vent burned like a single coal pinned in black cloth, and men who had laughed at his summer labor fixed their eyes on that light as if it were a church bell made visible. By 1 in the morning, the temperature in Coldwater, Nebraska, had fallen from 28 degrees above zero to 31 below, and the town of 341 souls learned in one violent descent what frontier arithmetic always settled in the end: heat saved, walls chosen, distance judged, and pride paid for in flesh. The rope Glenn had stretched from post to post was already carrying its first line of hands through white darkness. The barrels beneath the drift were already giving back what they had taken for months. No one called them foolish then. 8 months earlier, on May 14th, 1887, Glenn had come into Coldwater with a mule wagon that listed slightly to the left, a box of iron tools polished from use rather than display, and 3 oilcloth notebooks wrapped in waxed twine. The notebooks had belonged to his wife, Zanna Mercer, Barn Sanna Corpola, daughter of Finnish settlers who had crossed 2 winters in northern Michigan before moving west for cheaper ground and thinner promises. She had died in March of a lung fever that the doctor from North Platte named and could not stop. And when Glenn folded her dresses for burial, he had found the notebooks in the cedar chest under their bed, each page crowded with temperatures, fuel tallies, sketch lines, and short sentences written in a hand so narrow it seemed carved. Sanna had not learned her methods from books purchased in town. She had learned them from her father, who had learned them on rocky farms where timber could not be spared, and stone held what wood release too quickly. She had measured winter not by dates, but by retention. How long a wall stayed warm after the stove went dark, how deep frost traveled under thresholds, how far a family could move in a gale with one hand on a fixed line. In the first notebook, she had written a sentence Glenn read aloud on his first night in Coldwater, alone in the wagon bed under a blanket stiff with trail dust. Heat that must be made twice is heat already lost. In the second, she had copied costs and dimensions from shelters her kin had built near Marquette, with notes about barrel spacing, clay seals, and vent baffles. In the third, she had listed signs that winter would come hard and early, not as folklore but as pattern. Waterfowl migration dates against moon phase, muskrat lodge height against floodplain marks, and cloud rings against barometric drop. Coldwater sat on a railroad spur and believed itself guarded by that iron line, though the nearest dependable supply wagon came from farther south. Once roads softened and then froze again. The town had one church, one schoolhouse, one blacksmith, and one general store that served as ledger house, rumor mill, and moral court in equal measure. The leading merchant, Silas Pike, was a man built broad through middle age and prosperity, with a waistcoat that fit close over a full stomach, cuffs that stayed clean because others lifted freight for him, and hair oiled flat each morning as if weather answered discipline. He understood inventory, debt, and advantage, and he had grown used to being the first man consulted when worry entered a household. Glenn did not consult him. On May 18th, he bought a narrow lot on the north edge of town for $38 in silver and paper, ground most settlers had rejected because it lay open to winter wind with no windbreak, but a split rail line and low scrub. Pike watched the purchase recorded at the counter, lifted one eyebrow, and asked in a voice loud enough for waiting customers whether Mercer meant to build a house or a warning sign. Glenn answered only with acreage dimensions and quitclaim language. And he was 36, lean from labor, with hands that had callus under each finger pad, and a healed scar crossing his left knuckle where a broad axe had glanced years before. He had the look of a man who had learned to keep working while grief stood nearby. Glenn heard the jokes often enough to know their rhythm. But he measured his days by the notebook and the sun, not by the porch talk near Pike's door. When evening came, he checked his stakes, covered his tools, and read Santa's figures again by lantern before sleep. By the second week of June, Glenn had marked his lot with stakes and twine, then dug his first trench with a spade blade 12 inches wide and a mattock head he sharpened every third evening. He laid out the shelter on Santa's dimensions: a main chamber 14 feet by 18, floor sunk 5 feet below grade, side walls 18 inches thick, intended not for beauty but for mass, roofline low and sloped to shed drifts instead of carrying them, entry corridor angled to break direct wind and trap cold air below sleeping level. He paid $2.10 for a wagon load of mixed fieldstone from a farmer 3 miles east, then another $1 for clay-rich soil stripped from a creek cut where the bank showed red. The first structure on the lot was not a wall but a temporary shed where he kept lime under oilcloth and tools on peg rails, because materials ruined by rain cost more than materials bought dear. He mixed mortar lean, 1 part lime to 3 parts sand, for exterior joints that needed breath as much as bond. He drove split cottonwood posts at the chamber corners, not as permanent frame but as guides while earth walls were raised and tamped. Each evening he recorded depth gained, joints set, and fuel burned in one of Santa's notebooks, adding his own notes in block letters below hers. On June 19th he wrote, "Wind from north at dusk. Frost. Warning in low ground, though calendar says summer." He needed thermal mass beyond stone walls, and he chose the cheapest vessel the town discarded. Empty whiskey barrels came stacked behind Pike's store, many sound in stave and hoop, though stained by old spirit. Glenn asked the yard boy the price and was told 12 cents each if taken before inventory day. He paid cash for 12 the first week, then 10 more, then whatever came available, rolling each barrel through alley dust across the road and out to the north lot where boys sometimes followed for sport. He sorted creek rock by size into 3 piles: fist-sized for lower fill, egg-sized for interlock, and gravel for gaps. He tamped each layer with a cut tamper pole, poured sand to settle voids, then capped the top with clay mixed with straw so heat would move slowly through the packed body instead of flashing away. These barrels were not random hoarding. They were placed in sequence along the future stove wall and entry trench where passing warm air could charge them through evening hours. Santa's figures gave target spacing at 4 inches between staves and wall face, enough for circulation, not enough for dangerous draft. Glenn chalked each placement number on the hoops, then covered the lower third with packed earth to keep the line stable against shifting frost. He had no hired crew. He had Cedar, a buckskin mare patient under load, and a mule named Brant that leaned into traces without complaint. Together they hauled stone from Willow Creek until the harness leather turned pale with dried sweat. Silas Pike saw the line of barrels rising from the dug lot and found language for what others had only suspicion. One afternoon, standing on his porch in front of 2 ranch foremen and the post rider, he pointed his cane toward the north edge and said that Mercer was building himself a handsome grave in installments, and any man with sense would save his money for lumber rather than bury it in dirt and old drink casks. Laughter carried quickly in a town where street width was narrow and work slowed in heat. By market day, the name had settled: Mercer's grave. Children repeated it without understanding. Teamsters used it as they passed, half mocking, half testing whether Glenn would flare. He did not flare. He bought nails by the pound when he had cash, traded venison for lamp oil when he did not, and kept building to a plan set by measurements rather than reception. In late June, he added a vent stack with an iron collar scavenged from a broken stovepipe, angled to draw without inviting direct downdraft, In early July, he started cutting a secondary chamber for root storage, cooler and drier than the main room, with floor bins planned for turnips, carrots, and potatoes packed in sand. He marked on the wall in charcoal the line where future bunks would stand if more than one household needed shelter. He left room for that from the beginning. By the first week of August, the shelter's walls had reached shoulder height from the sunk floor. 28 barrels were filled and seated, and the phrase Mercer's grave had traveled far enough that visiting freight men asked directions to see it. They expected a ruin in progress. They found instead a geometry of work: straight trench, measured slope, dry stacked collar stones waiting for mortar, and a widower who moved with deliberate economy, as if each task had already been rehearsed in the pages he kept wrapped against weather. The town mistook that discipline for obstinacy because it had not yet been asked to depend upon it. 3 weeks later, on August the 29th, 1887, heat still lay over Coldwater like a weight. With the noon thermometer outside Pike's store reading 92 degrees, flies thick around the hitch rail, and dust lifting from wagon wheels in pale sheets that made every throat raw by supper, the freight clerk came off the afternoon train with 2 envelopes and a face that did not invite conversation, crossed to the notice board by the depot office, and pinned up a typed bulletin stating that a bridge trestle west of Julesburg had failed under load, that repairs would take uncertain weeks, and that coal shipments on the spur would be irregular through winter. Men read it twice, then looked past one another as if the meaning might soften by being shared. It did not soften. Coldwater had counted on railroad predictability the way a child counted on sunrise, and now the line that fed stoves and lanterns had become a promise with gaps. Pike moved quickly to practical theater, as he always did when fear entered public space. He stood in his doorway with ledger in hand, announced that current stock remained available, and advised households to purchase in moderation so all might be served. The words were fair. The arithmetic beneath them was harder. His coal shed held less than he had ordered in June, and no one knew whether October would bring 3 cars or none. By evening, 2 ranch foremen had bought extra sacks. The schoolteacher had taken an advance allotment for the schoolhouse stove, and old men who had not hurried for years hurried now, as if delay itself could lower a room's future temperature. Glenn read the notice without comment, folded a copy into Santa's second notebook, and returned north with a mule cart of creekstone before the sun went down. He had already been working to a severe winter plan, but the rail bulletin changed scale. A private shelter would no longer be enough. If supply uncertainty met a fast northern cold, then households with poor insulation, thin fuel, or illness would fail in sequence, and each failure would send more souls into the open at the worst possible hour. That night he widened his charcoal marks on the root chamber wall and added a second tally column labeled Extra Bunks. Santa's notebooks held method, but they also held memory, and memory sharpened his judgment when town confidence tried to dull it. Her father had taught in numbers first, Proverbs second. 2 inches of ice outside did not matter if the wall mass inside had been charged by evening. A draft at ankle height mattered more than a crack near rafters. 1 room heated and sealed could preserve life where 4 rooms half heated would waste fuel into dark corners. Santa had copied all of that in a script that left little room for sentiment, but in the margins she had written family records. The winter of 1869 near Marquette when snow stood level with window sashes. The January week in 1873 when outside air stayed below 20, below for 4 nights, and her mother baked bread in an earth-braced oven because surface wood had frozen damp. Those notes were not stories told for comfort. They were operating instructions inherited in grief and survival. By the first week of September, Glenn had expanded the work into a connected system that looked ungainly from the road and functioned with exact purpose underground. The sleeping chamber measured 14 by 18 feet, as planned, with plank bunks fixed in 2 levels along the leeward wall. The food chamber, 10 by 12, sat lower by 8 inches to hold cooler air. Between them ran a low corridor, 21 feet from stove alcove to outer bend, lined on both sides with stone-filled barrels seated shoulder to shoulder in packed earth. He brought the count to 64 by October 3rd. Each barrel was tamped in layers, sanded between stones, capped with clay, and skirted at the base with chinked sod to prevent air loss around the staves. When both stoves ran from late afternoon to bedtime, the corridor absorbed heat like a kiln bank, then gave it back in long, quiet release after midnight. In test nights with outside air at 12 degrees above, interior readings held between 52 and 56. He tracked every purchase in pencil, date, and amount. Lime, $12 even by autumn. Cut nails, $4.80. Lamp oil, $6.10. Salt pork for broth stock, $9.30. Additional canvas, rope, and iron hooks, $13.20. Miscellaneous hardware and replacement shovel heads, $6.50. By November 18th, the total had reached $71.40, a sum that would have bought frame comforts in another season, but here became buried insurance. He preserved 180 pounds of turnips and carrots in sand bins, hung smoked venison strips in a cedar vent box lined with wire, and stored flour tins on shelves braced with diagonal cleats, so vibration or frost heave would not spill the lot in one shift. In mid-September, he began the rope line, because shelter without access in whiteout was theory, not rescue. He braided 3 lengths of hemp into one heavier run, tarred key segments against moisture, and stretched it from his entry post toward town by stages, using buried barrel anchors as dead weight where no permanent post stood. Each anchor sat 4 feet deep, packed with stone and clay, with the rope eye bolted through an iron plate to spread strain. He tested every section by leaning full body weight and then by hitching Brant to a loop and pulling across angle turns. If a line failed in daylight, it would fail sooner in storm dark. He replaced 3 weak eyes before he trusted it. By the second week of October, geese passed over Coldwater in hard V formations at dawn, lower and earlier than local hunters expected, and Glenn stopped in the field long enough to count 3 separate flights moving south on a wind that had not yet turned. 2 days later, he rode Willow Creek and found muskrat lodges built high, with extra mud at their windward faces and reed stacks thicker than in ordinary years. On October the 15th and 16th, a pale ring held around the moon through nearly the full night, neither fading with cloud nor breaking by morning haze. Santa had underlined that pattern twice. Glenn copied the dates into her margin and added 1 line in his own block hand. Signs aligned. Prepare for sudden drop. He carried that warning to the church social on October 19th, where tables had been set with boiled coffee, pie crust trimmed with care despite dear flour, and a raffle basket that raised funds for school slates. He did not grandstand. He waited until songs ended and asked leave to speak. In 40 measured words, he advised households to split and stack wood before first snow, cache water in covered barrels indoors, seal 1 room per house for concentrated heat, and prepare to move elders early if January struck in force. He offered dimensions and labor help for any family willing to dig partial earth walls. Pike answered from near the stove with a smile so practiced it looked painted on. He said the town had endured winters before and would endure again. That fear multiplied faster than frost, and that Mercer's habit of digging and burying might suit a grieving drifter, but did not suit serious men building a proper settlement. The room laughed in the old pattern, relieved to hear confidence spoken in a familiar voice. Social risk did the rest. No one wished to be counted among alarmists if the season proved mild. 2 women asked Glenn quiet questions at the door on their way out. No one else did. As frost edged cattle troughs in November, Pike hardened his line. He refused Glenn's store credit for flour, though he had extended credit to others with longer ledgers, and he began telling customers within earshot that only badgers chose to live downward when timber stood ready upright. After the first sustained cold snap on November the 27th, he raised coal from 9 cents to 21 cents per scuttle, blaming freight uncertainty and replacement costs. The price held because there was nowhere else to buy. Families paid what they could and bought less than they needed. Pike recorded every sale in neat columns and slept poorly despite the numbers. Glenn kept hauling stone. One afternoon in early December, with sky the pale white that erased horizon depth, a boy named Eli Wren walked beside Cedar as she dragged a sled of broken creek rock up from the cut bank. Eli was 12, narrow in the shoulders and old enough to know when a question carried more than curiosity. He asked why Glenn still hauled weight when the weather felt kind and roads were still passable. Glenn set the brake, checked the harness knot, and answered without heat, "Let them talk. Wind does not care what a man believes." Eli nodded as if he had been handed a tool rather than a phrase, then took hold of the rear trace and helped guide Cedar over the rut lip. By December 22nd, a soft spell settled over the county, warm enough at noon for porch doors to stand open, and warm enough by dusk that children skated only at Pond Center, where ice held thicker. Men declared the worst likely delayed. Laundry lines reappeared. A few households burned extra coal for comfort rather than ration. Glenn used those days to finish what fair weather made possible. He cut additional blanket hooks near the entry trench, sealed 2 hairline mortar cracks in the leeward wall, stacked split kindling in dry bundles wrapped with twine for quick ignition, and set 3 cast-iron kettles by the stove where snow could be melted without crowding the floor. He moved his own bedroll to the draft side and marked the warmest corner for infants or the fevered, though he had no infants and no household left but himself. On January 2nd, 1888, he rode to town with Cedar and posted 2 handbills in plain script, one at the church gate and one by the rail office. If severe storm comes, warm shelter available north edge. Follow fixed rope line from church road post. Bring blankets if possible. No payment asked. Pike read the notice, said nothing, and turned back to his counter where his cuff remained clean and his coal scale steady. 4 days later at noon on January the 6th, the northern horizon darkened into a blue wall that looked less like weather than advancing stone, and by sundown the first sleet struck clabbered in hard slants that rattled window glass like thrown seed. Glenn lit the lantern above his roof vent, checked each rope knot by hand, banked both stoves until barrel skins warmed through and left the door latch unbarred. Coldwater still had daylight enough to choose pride. Night would remove that choice. Night removed that choice by 9 o'clock, when sleet hardened into driven ice and the north wind came down flat over the open lots with a sound like torn canvas held to the ear. Glenn stood in the entry band with a lantern hooded in tin, one mitten off so he could feel rope fibers with bare fingers, and watched the first white streamers begin to snake over ground that had been brown at supper. He had already set 2 kettles at a low boil, one for broth and one for meltwater, and he had laid cedar ash along the trench floor where boots would track in snow and need purchase. The barrels behind the stove wall were warm to the touch, not hot, exactly as Santa had specified when heat had to last until dawn rather than blaze and vanish at midnight. At 10:15, Eli Wren appeared at the first post with his mother and his grandfather, all 3 bent low and moving hand over hand, as if they were crossing a river current. Glenn took the old man under one arm, counted 6 paces backward into the corridor, and set them on the leeward bench where warmer air held. He gave Eli one task and then another, because boys who could work did not freeze in panic. Shake blankets clear of crusted ice, past mugs. Keep the door curtain weighted with sandbags each time it lifted. More souls came in intervals measured by the lantern swing outside. First 2, then 5. Then a woman carrying a ledger wrapped in apron cloth. Then the blacksmith with his right eyebrow rimed white and his left hand stiff from gripping the rope too long. By 11, wind speed had risen beyond any ordinary winter gale. It struck from north by northwest in violent pulses that shifted loose planks and sent dry snow under eaves like flour through a sieve. Surface visibility fell under 2 wagon lengths. Glenn moved between chambers with deliberate economy, closing one iron damper, opening another quarter turn, feeding stove mouths in small charges so the draft would not overpull and waste fuel. The thermal corridor did its work in silence. Air in the sleeping chamber held at 53 degrees, while the outside mercury, read once at the protected post, had already passed 5 below and was still dropping. The difference between those numbers was not comfort. It was survival margin. Near midnight, he rode Cedar once more to the church road post because no one else would ask him to, and because he knew who would still be waiting behind lit windows, uncertain whether to leave. He tied a scarf over nose and mouth, leaned from the saddle to keep one gloved hand on the guide rope, and moved by memory of fence lines half erased in blowing white. At the parsonage, he pounded with a hammer butt until Reverend Markham opened, eyes wide, coat half buttoned. Glenn gave 10 words and no sermon. Bring your wife. Close this door. Take the rope. Keep moving. At the schoolhouse, he found only dark panes and drift against the east step up to knee height. He marked the door in chalk, one diagonal slash, to tell any later searcher it had been checked. By 12:40, the storm had turned from weather to assault. The wind no longer traveled in gusts and rests. It held one sustained force that made timber groan and roof nails complain. Snow, fine as ground salt, forced itself through cracks around window casings in houses that had stood 10 winters without such intrusion. In Pike's store, sacks were stacked to interior shutters, while 2 hired hands tried to brace the north windows with flour crates. Cole sat in the shed behind, but the path to it was already a trench filling faster than men could clear. Pike ordered lamps lowered to save oil, then ordered them raised again when the room darkened and fear began to speak in whispers. At 1:00, the thermometer nailed outside the church porch read 31 below zero, and the ink in the sexton's pen thickened in its bottle. Roof drifts built not in layers but in sculpted ridges that shifted under their own weight, then dropped against doorways in sudden slabs that jammed hinges from the outside. A team horse broke trace in the livery lane and vanished into blown white before any hand could catch the trailing leather. At Glenn's shelter, the interior count reached 38 souls, then 43. He moved his own bedroll to the door trench and gave the warmest corner to Martha Ellery, who could no longer feel her feet, and to Ada Hale, whose husband had gone out an hour earlier to assist at Pike's place and had not returned. Ruth Ellery died between 1 and 2 in the morning. She had left her daughter's house against advice to fetch her medicine satchel from her own shelf, insisting that breath tonics and heart drops could not be left in another room when roads might close for days. She was 63, careful in ordinary weather, and stubborn in the way long responsibility can harden into habit. Neighbors found her at first light less than 20 yards from her gate, one hand still inside her coat where the satchel strap had broken. Glenn said her name aloud when he heard, then assigned 2 men to prepare pine boards and a stove-warmed room for her daughter before grief turned to collapse. A quarter hour later, Deputy Tom Hale did not survive the loft failure at Pike's store. He had climbed to the upper rack to pull down reserve coal sacks when a roof beam overloaded by drift and struck by vibration from a loose shutterboard split near the joint and dropped a section of snow and timber across the loft ladder. The men below reached him quickly, but the cold had already taken too much in the minutes before they could free him and move him through the blown passage. Pike came out of that building with sawdust in his hair, one glove missing, and a face so drained of color it looked carved from tallow. By 2:40, Pike reached Glenn's rope line at the church road post with 12 souls behind him, their coats white-sheathed and their eyelashes frozen together in clumps. He had tied one end of his own belt to the rope where his fingers could no longer close, and he was guiding old Amos Dillard by shoulder pressure, because Dillard had lost sensation in both hands. Glenn took Pike at the trench mouth, pulled him inside, stripped his wet outer gloves, and thrust dry mittens into his hands before speaking a single word about the living line still outside. Then he pointed to the broth kettle and gave instruction in the same tone he used with everyone else. One ladle each. No more until all are served. Keep the cup moving. No one called the place Mercer's Grave then. They called it Down Below, Warm Room, the North Shelter, anything but the name that had carried laughter all summer and fall. The stone barrels along the corridor sweated faintly where damp wool brushed them, and children slept against them without waking, because the radiant warmth came steady and low, not in scorching bursts. Glenn sent Eli and 2 older men in pairs along the first 100 yards of rope, twice between 3 and 4, each pair tied by waist loop and carrying bell and lantern to locate any souls stoled in drift shadow near posts. They returned with 3 more. Nora Pike, dazed but breathing, schoolteacher Helen Shore with frost-stiff skirts and a split knuckle, and Noah Bright, 19, who had been searching the schoolhouse lane for his younger brother until Reverend Markham forced him onto the line. Little Samuel Bright was not found in time. He had left the Bright place before full dark on an errand no longer clear in the telling, and when the wind erased tracks, the gap between schoolhouse and parsonage became a blind white trough where sound carried poorly and distance lied. Glenn and 2 rope teams probed that stretch at first gray light on January 7th, driving poles ahead of each step and listening for any answer between gusts. They recovered Samuel from a drift pocket near the fence break, small body curled against the boards, scarf iced hard at the mouth. His mother identified him before noon in the church side room, and the town's reckoning with the storm acquired its 3rd name. 3 days passed before the wind fully eased, though its worst violence spent itself by the morning of January 7th. During those 72 hours, Glenn rationed by ledger and measure. Broth at dawn and dusk, hard bread softened in kettle water for elders, venison strips cut in finger lengths for children, lamp oil trimmed to 1 low flame per chamber after midnight. He scraped ice from vent lips every hour to keep draft clear, rotated bedding from damp edge to dry center, and kept a tally on the wall with charcoal marks for arrivals, departures, and fuel consumption. Pike remained at the ladle station through the first full day, silent except to count cups, his cuffs long since stained, his posture reduced from merchant command to ordinary labor. On January 10th, when the sky finally opened in a pale, hard blue and temperatures climbed to 11 above by noon, souls began to return in guided groups to houses still standing. Many doors had to be dug free from outside drifts deeper than a man's hip. 3 roofs had partial collapse. The schoolhouse porch rail was gone. Pike's coal shed door could not be found until men probed with fence poles along the drift face and struck plank by sound. Inside Glenn's chambers, the barrel corridor still held warmth 12 hours after both stove fires were allowed to sink. Eli touched one hoop with his palm and looked at Glenn without speaking, then nodded once as if an argument settled itself. Cold water buried Ruth Ellery, Tom Hale, and Samuel Bright on January 12th under a brittle sun that gave light without mercy. The graves were cut in ground opened by heated irons and shovels worked in turns because frost fought every inch. Reverend Markham spoke the names plainly. and when he reached Samuel's, the line of mourners bent as if the wind had shifted through them again. Pike stood bareheaded through the prayer despite the cold, and Ada Hale accepted his arm only when the path iced near the wagon rut. Glenn stood at the edge of the gathered line, hat in both hands, cedar tied to the fence behind him, his boots still marked with clay from the shelter floor. After the burial, no proclamation was made and no bell was rung for public judgment, yet the reckoning began in practical footsteps. Women came to return blankets folded tighter than before, and stayed to ask for barrel counts and trench angles. Men who had repeated Pike's porch jokes asked where to set the first post if a lot sloped east. Pike opened his ledger on a side counter and sold nails, lime, and rope to Glenn at cost, then posted the same rates for every household building partial earth walls through spring. When the church board asked what had changed him, he answered in a voice heard across the room that mockery had spent itself against stone, and that a storekeeper who priced heat beyond reach in a rail failure had no moral right to lead any town of honest souls. Glenn listened, then set Santa's second notebook on the table between them all, pages weighted flat by an iron wrench. He did not ask for apology. He did not offer a quick absolution. He said only that winter kept no accounts and that next season would test memory as hard as this one had tested timber. Then he marked 3 Saturdays before planting and told every household willing to dig, lift, and learn to meet him on the north lot at sunup, where he would teach them how to store heat in stone before the wind came looking again. No one answered him at once. The church boardroom held the dry smell of wool coats thawing near the stove, and the men who had once laughed from Pike's porch now stood with their hats turning slowly in their hands, as if each brim were a ledger page they had to read again before speaking. Reverend Markham broke the silence first. He stepped to the table, placed one palm beside Santa's open notebook, and said that the church cellar would be opened on Friday nights for tool storage, so families could begin digging at first light on Saturdays. He asked Glenn to name the first measurements in front of all, with no private instruction for favored households and no fee beyond labor shared. Glenn nodded once and drew a square on scrap paper with a carpenter's pencil, worn almost to the ferrule. He marked 14 by 16 for smaller lots, entry trench angled east by southeast, sleeping platform above cold sink level, and barrel spacing no wider than a man's hand. Pike watched, face drawn, then stepped forward and added his own statement without ceremony. Rope, nails, and lime would be sold at posted cost through spring thaw, and any man caught buying to resell at profit in shortage would lose credit at his counter. That same afternoon, while light still held on the snow crust outside, a wind out of the northwest sharpened with uncommon speed. The glass in Markham's study fell from 29 8/10 to 28 9 in less than 2 hours, and by dusk a low scud cloud had swallowed the weak sun. Glenn had seen that drop before in Santa's columns, paired with a short interval storm that rode behind the larger systems and struck households when fatigue had already loosened their discipline. At 5:30 he crossed from church to Pike's store, where the merchant and 2 hands were still resetting shelves, toppled during the first blizzard, and told him in plain terms to close by 7, bank interior heat, and move all loose sacks below window line. Pike did not argue. He sent his clerk with a handbell down 2 blocks, calling for souls to secure doors and keep 1 lamp lit through the night in case rope teams had to move again. By the second evening after the burial, on January the 14th, the temperature had fallen from 12 above at noon to 14 below before midnight, with steady wind near 40 miles in the hour and fine snow running level with porch decks. It was not the vast white assault of January 6th, yet it came over a town already thinned in fuel and strength, where many stoves had burned hot and wasteful in panic, and where too many pantries had been opened at once for mourners, neighbors, and the exhausted, Glenn reopened his north shelter before supper and relit both stoves to charge the barrel corridor. He sent Eli Wren to the church road post with a wrapped lantern and strict instruction. Keep the light low. Keep the line clear. Return every 15 minutes whether or not anyone follows. Eli obeyed, boots crunching over drift ridges, shoulders set with the seriousness of a boy who had seen one storm take a child his own age. The second storm revealed a different failure than the first. Roofs did not collapse in mass. They leaked cold through joints hastily patched with wet cloth and prayer. Families who had survived the great night in Glenn's chambers returned to houses whose interior walls had taken moisture from thaw and now shed frost into bedrooms with each gust. The Halverson place, built of green cottonwood boards only 3 years prior, lost its stove draw at 9 o'clock when a vent cap iced shut, and by 10 the mother, Ingrid Halverson, was warming her 2 daughters by holding heated bricks under a quilt tent beside the oven door. Across town, Amos Dillard, whose hands had gone numb on the rope line, could no longer split kindling with force enough to keep his fire fed, and he sat wrapped in 2 coats beside a stove that glowed red at the belly and cold at the pipe. Coldwater had not run out of courage. It had run short on margin. Near midnight, Pike's store suffered the blow he had feared most and least understood. The north windows, patched after the earlier storm with boards set from inside, held against direct wind, but the rear sheet roof over the coal bins had taken hidden damage at one rafter seat when Tom Hale died in the loft. Under new drift load, that weak point failed with a flat crack, dropping half the roof into the coal run and burying the shovel path under packed snow and splintered plank. Pike and his 2 hands dug by lantern for 40 minutes, pulling chunks of slate and wood barehanded until knuckles bled through wool. Yet each cleared section slumped again from the side wall as wind drove powder into every cavity. By 1 in the morning he had fuel in his shed, and no safe way to reach it. His status as keeper of supply, already morally broken, now failed in physical fact. At 1:20, a group of 6 came down Glenn's rope line from the south, then 2 more, then 3. They arrived not in dramatic rush but in staggered need. An elder with labored breath, a child with a cough that would not settle, a ranch hand whose boot soles had split from repeated thaw and freeze and now leaked with each step. Glenn set arrivals by condition, not by name. Fever to the inner wall, wet boots off at once, broth in half ladles until stomachs steadied. Pike came at 1:40 with his clerk, shoulders white with blown snow, and reported the shed collapse in 30 clipped words. Glenn handed him a shovel and directed him to trench duty at the entry bin, where drift had begun to lip over the lower step. No speech was exchanged about pride, blame, or old insults. The work consumed all language that did not serve life. By dawn on January 15th, the second storm had held 18 hours. The outside thermometer at the church porch read 26 below, with wind still driving, though less violently than before. Inside Glenn's shelter, air remained near 51 in the sleeping chamber and 47 at the corridor mouth. The barrels gave back heat with the same patience they had shown on the first great night, and families who had doubted whether one man's summer labor could shelter many now sat shoulder to shoulder against curved staves, feeling warmth radiate through wool and bone. Eli and Reverend Markham made 2 rope checks after sunup and found the line partially drifted near the old fence break, but still tight at each buried anchor. Glenn sent Pike and Noah Bright with shovels and a mattock to clear the segment. Pike labored without pause until his breath came ragged and his gloves froze stiff at the fingertips. Noah watched him once, then handed him a dry pair without comment. The human cost of this second blow was quieter, yet it cut deep because it struck those already shaken by grief. Amos Dillard died on January the 15th, Just after noon, not in open drift but in his own chair, after refusing to leave his house through the night because he did not wish, as he told his niece, to be carried again like freight by younger men. When she returned with Markham and Eli at first light, he was conscious but fading, hands waxen from prolonged cold, voice no more than a whisper. He asked that his woodpile be given to Ingrid Halverson's daughters, and that his pocket Bible go to the schoolhouse shelf where Samuel Bright's primers had been set aside. He died before the next kettle was ready. Glenn helped carry him to the church side room and set his hat on the folded coat at his feet. A second loss came with less warning. Marta Quinn, who kept laundry accounts for half the town and had taken in 2 widows after the first storm, developed a chest fever in the overcrowded back room where damp quilts had been hung too near a weak draft flu. She had survived the January 6th whiteout and spent 4 nights nursing others. On January 16th, with temperature still below zero and roads blocked beyond the rail spur, her breathing worsened beyond what mustard poultice and warm broth could relieve. She asked for ink, signed over her paid notes so no debtor family would be pressed for winter balances, and told Pike's clerk to burn the duplicate ledger if her sister from Kearney did not arrive by spring. She died before evening prayers. Her death was not violent. It was no less devastating. Coldwater buried her beside Ruth Ellery and Tom Hale 4 days later, and the town's row of fresh mounds lengthened by another measured cut of frozen earth. Through those 3 days, desperation mounted in practical forms that frontier souls recognized more readily than tears. Flour scooped with a flatter hand, lamp wicks trimmed shorter than habit, boots patched with harness leather, one room living in homes built for 4. Glenn's preparations stood in hard contrast to that contraction. In his food chamber, turnips remained firm in sand bins because he had lifted them before first hard freeze. Venison strips still hung dry because smoke vents had been lined and checked for icing. Water kettles did not run empty because snow melt was rotated in a strict cycle and covered against soot. What had seemed excessive in October now proved merely sufficient in January. Coldwater saw that sufficiency and understood, perhaps for the first time, that prudence carried a cost only until calamity arrived. Help came sought directly before the storm had fully passed. Late on January the 16th, with light thinning and wind easing to a long moan over rooflines, Nora Pike walked the rope line alone from the store to Glenn's shelter, left hand on hemp, right arm carrying a basket wrapped in a flour sack. She had not spoken publicly since Samuel Bright's burial, and many in town had watched her move through chores as if every task were an act of penance done in private. At Glenn's trench entrance, she set down the basket, removed her gloves, and said that the Pike cellar held 23 sound blankets and 2 sacks of cracked wheat that had been kept for spring resale. She asked where they were most needed and whether her father should bring them now or wait until morning. Glenn answered that morning would waste heat and daylight both. He sent her back with Eli and Noah, each tied to the line at 10-foot intervals, and within 1 hour the blankets were spread across 3 households whose stoves had failed, while the wheat went into Markham's soup pot for distribution at dawn. After midnight, Pike himself came to the shelter door again, this time carrying not request, but record. He held a folded sheet listing names of households with least fuel, least food, and weakest walls, compiled from his own ledgers and corrected by Nora's rounds. He offered the list to Glenn and said that his figures had measured debt for too many years and needed to measure risk if the town meant to remain a town by spring. Glenn took the paper, scanned each line by lantern, and assigned routes for morning teams. Markham to the East Block, Noah and Eli to Schoolhouse Lane, Pike and the blacksmith to Halverson and Dillard properties, Glenn to the north lots where newest houses sat exposed. No one asked who led. Leadership had settled where preparation and steadiness met. By January the 17th at noon, the second storm lifted. The sky cleared from west to east in ragged strips, and sunlight struck drifts hard enough to throw glare under the hat brims. Cold water emerged altered again, not by spectacle this time, but by sequence. Rope checks at dawn and dusk, shared fuel tally at church, one posted board of vulnerable households, one common instruction day kept regardless of rank. Glenn stood by his barrel wall that evening with Pike, Markham, Eli, and 6 others, while Stoves banked for the night, and he began the first lesson exactly where he had promised, chalk on plank, hands black with soot and lime, teaching how to store heat in stone before the wind came looking again. Glenn drew the first cross-section on a pine board, propped against a barrel hoop, then pressed the chalk into Eli Wren's hand and told him to mark the cold sink at the trench bend so every soul present could see why a straight doorway bled heat faster than a poor stove could replace it. Pike stood opposite, holding the lantern steady while frost steamed off his cuffs, and Reverend Markham read out measurements as Glenn spoke them. Trench width 3 feet, turn at 7 feet. Sleeping platform raised 16 inches above floor grade. Stove wall backed by packed stone with no hidden voids. The lesson was not abstract. Between each measurement, Glenn sent pairs out with blankets, coal scraps, and broth tins to households listed on Pike's risk sheet, and each pair returned to report what failed first in every home they entered. Loose window sash, wet woodpile, unsealed crawl gap. The teaching and the rescue became one labor, because Coldwater had no surplus hours left for separate work. By January 18th, under a sky hard and bright as hammered tin, Glenn posted a slate at the church gate listing daily shares from his own stores and from common donations. Cracked wheat by cup measure, venison by strip count, turnips by household size, lamp oil by wick length rather than bottle. No family was turned away, yet no family was allowed to take without record, because scarcity punished vagueness before it punished greed. Pike added his own slate beside it, this one with hardware rates fixed at cost in his own handwriting, and below those figures he posted a second line that startled the town more than any storm warning had. No winter interest charged on essential fuel debt through thaw. Men who had borrowed at hard terms in November read that sentence twice, then looked toward Glenn's north lot, where a queue had formed not for charity, but for instruction. 3 days later, when the rail office received confirmation that trestle repairs west of Julesburg would continue into February, Coldwater did not panic as it had in August. It rationed. On January 21st, Glenn and Markham organized stove rounds at dawn and dusk, checking draft caps, clearing ice collars, and teaching children how to test for hidden leaks with a candle flame held low at floor seams. Helen Shaw brought the school slates to the shelter and copied Santa's heat retention tables in careful columns, so each household could keep one page by its stove. Nora Pike inventoried blankets by condition, mending torn binding with waxed thread at Glenn's bench. The expensive failures of autumn now stood in plain contrast. Pike's collapsed coal shed, the cracked plaster parlors built for show, the tall rooms that consumed fuel like open mouths. Glenn's low rooms, stone mass and buried anchors had cost $71.40 with months of labor, while 1 week of panic buying had consumed more than that in many houses and left them colder. As January turned toward its final week, souls came to Glenn in ones and twos, and the reckoning moved through doorways rather than podiums. Ada Hale arrived first, carrying Tom Hale's deputy badge wrapped in linen. She asked Glenn to place it in his tool chest until spring because she could not bear the sight of polished brass while she still slept in borrowed rooms. She said without ornament that she had laughed when Tom repeated the name Mercer's grave, and that she had believed competence wore a waistcoat and owned a storefront. Glenn accepted the badge and pointed her toward the stove wall where Eli was marking barrel spacing for her new trench. The work waited. So did grief. Both were given room. Pike came after sunset on January the 27th, when wind had eased and the moon rose clear over the rail spur. He brought his ledger, the same volume he had once held like a scepter at the store counter, and set it open on Glenn's table to the pages where coal prices had doubled after first frost. He read each figure aloud, then read the names beside them, including households that had buried their dead that month. His voice remained steady until he reached Tom Hale's line, and then thinned, though he did not stop. He said he had called Glenn a drifter, a badger, and a gravedigger, because those words protected his standing when he should have protected his town. He said profit had looked like prudence until roofs fell and children were carried in from the drift. He asked whether any repayment could be named. Glenn answered that repayment in coin would flatter guilt and change little. He told Pike to keep selling at cost through spring, to publish stock levels each week so rumor could not become leverage, and to fund 40 rope hooks for households on the South Block, where wind run was worst. Pike said yes before Glenn finished the third condition. The next Saturday, February 2nd, 106 souls gathered in shifts at the north lot, some with shovels, some with notebooks, some with nothing but hands willing to lift. Glenn set teams by skill rather than rank. Ranch owners mixed clay beside hired boys. Widows measured trench angles with church carpenters. Markham hauled stone with Pike until both men's gloves split at the seams. Glenn corrected errors without softness and without contempt. When one man protested that 18-inch walls consumed too much lot space, Glenn walked him to the Halverson place, showed the frost line on interior boards, then placed his palm on a charged barrel in the shelter corridor, and said that winter did not grade by aesthetics. It graded by retained heat at 3 in the morning. The man returned and widened his trench. On February 9th, after the second full instruction day, the church board called for a formal gathering because private apologies, though honest, had begun to pile up like unstacked lumber, each sincere and none yet joined to public memory. The meeting was held in the schoolhouse at dusk, stove fired high, benches crowded, names recorded by Helen Shaw for the town archive. Markham opened with no sermon. He stated only that Coldwater had buried 5 souls in 10 days and had been preserved from greater loss by labor once mocked in the street. Then he asked those who had spoken against that labor to speak now, with the same volume they had once used for laughter. Silence held a long minute. Then voices rose one at a time. Marta Quinn's sister, Elsie, stood first and repeated the exact porch joke she had heard herself tell in October, word for word, though the memory shamed her. She said Marta had died after nursing others in rooms made cold by poor preparation, and that ridicule had delayed the work that could have kept those rooms warmer. A ranch foreman named Caleb Dent admitted he had warned younger hands away from Glenn's project so they would not be seen beside a widower building downward, and that he now worked from Glenn's drawings to rebuild his own bunkhouse foundation before next freeze. Pike stood last among the mockers and gave the shortest statement. He had used scarcity to enlarge his account book, and in so doing had narrowed the town's margin for survival. He asked no absolution and offered his stock records for public inspection through the next winter season. Helen Shaw wrote each statement in the register without trimming language or softening blame. When the bench creak settled and no further names were offered, Markham turned to Glenn and asked what answer he would give the town. Glenn rose slowly, hands still marked with lime. He did not begin with forgiveness, and he did not begin with injury. He began with method. He said Santa had written that heat lost in 1 careless hour must be earned back in 10 careful ones, and that communities obeyed the same arithmetic. He said mockery had cost Coldwater time, and time in frontier winter was a form of fuel no merchant could restock once spent. He named Ruth Ellery, Tom Hale, Samuel Bright, Amos Dillard, and Marta Quinn, pausing after each name until the room answered with silence. Then he said, with measured gravity, that he had not filled barrels to win arguments and would not now trade grief for easy words. If the town wished to call this forgiveness, that was the town's language. His own language was obligation. He would teach any soul willing to work, keep his door open in storm, and expect each household to pass the craft forward without charging the vulnerable for instruction. He ended by placing Santa's notebook on the front desk and inviting Helen Shaw to copy every page for the schoolhouse shelf. By the first week of March, thaw began in thin afternoon drips from South Eaves, and the first repaired freight trestle carried a reduced coal car into Coldwater on March 11th under armed caution from the rail company. For the first time in months, the depot platform held relief without clamor. Households no longer bought blind. They checked their posted fuel tallies, purchased to measure, and reserved labor days for trench finishing before spring planting. Pike kept his promise on prices and records. He also paid for 40 rope hooks, then 20 more when Markham's count showed need beyond the south block. Eli Wren apprenticed himself to Glenn after school hours, learning mortar mix by touch, not by scoop count alone, and by April he could set a barrel anchor true enough that Glenn trusted him on corners where load strain was highest. Years later, in the summer of 1896, Coldwater counted 389 souls, and visitors arriving by spur heard a new phrase spoken without irony at lumber stacks, church suppers, and land sales: "Build it, Mercer tight." It meant low where wind ran, thick where heat mattered, and honest in measure. It also meant posting common risk lists before blizzards, maintaining rope lines each October, and storing one shared reserve of blankets and grain under church lock, with 3 keys held by 3 households of different means. Pike's store remained standing, though its countermanner changed. Weekly stock boards stayed public year-round. Winter ledgers carried a column marked Mercy Credit, funded by voluntary overpayment in harvest months. Pike himself grew leaner, quieter, and less certain that authority could be worn like polished cloth. Glenn lived long enough to see Eli become Coldwater's most trusted builder of earth-braced rooms and thermal corridors. In 1903, when an early cold struck before corn shocks were fully in, Eli led rope teams without waiting for instruction and opened 3 Mercer-tight shelters in one night. Glenn watched from his doorway, one hand on Cedar's old halter peg, and said only that the line held. Cedar, long retired from hauling, died that autumn and was buried on the north edge above the first anchor trench, where spring grass came quick after rain. The original dugout still stands. Its lintel bears a plain carving copied from Santa Mercer's notebook and Helen Shaw's school hand. Store heat in stone, store mercy in deeds, for both must be ready before the storm. Children in Coldwater read those words each October before rope drills begin. They run gloved hands along old barrel hoops half buried in packed earth and learn, before winter asks the question, how their grandparents answered it. On October 6, 1896, the first full rope drill after harvest, 42 schoolchildren stood in 2 lines outside the north shelter, while Eli Wren checked mitten knots and lantern hoods, and Glenn Mercer, gray now at the temples and slower in the left knee, watched each child take the hemp with one hand and the shoulder of the child ahead with the other. Helen Shaw read names from her slate, then read them again at the trench mouth, because counting twice in fair weather cost nothing, and counting once in storm dark could cost a life. Inside, the old barrels still gave a faint evening warmth after one short fire. When the children had finished and the church bell marked 4, Ada Hale came up the path carrying the linen-wrapped deputy badge she had once left in Glenn's tool chest. She held it flat on both palms while Noah Bright and Reverend Markham stood nearby, hats off though the wind had turned sharp. "Tom should not remain folded in a drawer," she said. "He should stand where children learn what carelessness costs." Glenn nodded, took the badge, and walked it to the schoolhouse cabinet where Samuel Bright's primers had long been kept, setting brass beside books and writing one line in Helen Shaw's register: "Return to public memory, October the 6th, 1896. By the last week of October, Pike posted his winter stockboard every Monday before sunrise with coal weight, flour sacks, lamp oil tins, and rope coils listed in chalk large enough to read from the hitch rail. He kept no private reserve, and he invited Markham and Nora to check each figure against the backroom count before the store opened. One rancher muttered that Pike had become timid. Pike answered without heat that secrecy had nearly buried Coldwater once and would not govern his counter again. The muttering stopped when he handed over 40 new iron hooks, paid from his own account, for the South Block rope extensions. On November 2nd, Glenn opened Santa's 3 original notebooks on the church table and asked Helen Shaw, Eli, and 2 older students to make a second full copy on heavy rag paper, page for page, including margins where weather signs had been marked. The oilcloth covers were cracking at the fold, and lamp soot had already dimmed some pencil numbers. Glenn read each line aloud while Eli copied dimensions and Helen copied the sign columns. Geese dates, muskrat height, moon ring duration, pressure notes. When they finished after dusk, Glenn wrapped the originals in fresh waxed cloth and placed them in a tin lockbox under church custody, 3 keys held by Helen, Markham, and Nora Pike. January 11th, 1897 arrived with a clean morning and a dangerous noon. The north horizon hardened blue by midday, and by 3 the wind struck from the same quarter as in 1888, driving powder low and fast across the road cuts. Coldwater did not wait for panic. Pike rang the handbell at his own door and shouted route orders already posted since November. Eli and Noah checked rope tension from church post to schoolhouse lane. Helen moved children in pairs to the nearest Mercer tight rooms. Markham opened the church cellar reserve and issued blankets by ledger. Glenn stayed at the trench bend, one hand on the guideline, assigning arrivals by need exactly as he had years before. The storm held 16 hours and drove temperatures to 22 below by dawn, but no soul was lost in open ground, and no child was separated from a counted line. At first light, Pike's clerk brought the store ledgers to Glenn's table, where fuel allotments were recalculated by household size and wall condition, not by debt rank. A ranch family with long credit received less than a widow in a thin board house because need, not standing, governed the sheet. This time no one argued at the door. The argument had ended years earlier, in cold that had named its own terms. That evening, after stove checks were complete, the town gathered in the schoolhouse without summons. There was no formal confession line as in February of old, yet reckoning came with the same weight. Caleb Dent stood and said he had used Glenn's measurements in every bunkhouse repair and had taught the pattern to hired men who once laughed with him on Pike's porch. Nora Pike said aloud that she had heard the nickname Mercer's Grave first as amusement and now refused to let it be spoken except as record of error. Markham read the 5 winter names again from the register, and each bench remained silent through the last name. Then Pike stood with both hands on the back of the front bench, shoulders narrow now under a plain coat, and repeated what he had already admitted years before, this time without ledger in hand, because he believed steady action might spare him repeated public speech. "I profited when fear rose," he said. "I called caution weakness because caution did not pass through my scale. I watched a man fill barrels with stone and named him foolish, so I would not examine my own failures. The town corrected me by surviving what I had misjudged. I ask no release from memory. I ask only leave to keep serving under the terms this town now keeps. All eyes turned to Glenn. He remained seated for a long moment, thumb resting on the edge of Santa's copied table, where winter retention figures ran in neat columns. When he stood, his voice was roughened by age but steady in measure. "I will not turn grief into ceremony," he said. "You all know the names we carry. You all know what mockery costs when weather strips comfort away. If you seek a single word from me, I do not have it. I have work. Keep lines tarred. Keep one room sealed. Keep records open. Teach children before autumn, not after the first drift. Call that forgiveness if you need that word. I call it duty paid in advance." By spring planting, Coldwater had raised 6 new earth-braced shelters and improved 14 older houses with trench entries, packed stone stove walls, and measured sleeping platforms. Eli marked each finished site in Helen's map book with ink squares and barrel counts. Ada Hale requested one additional mark beside the schoolhouse cabinet entry where Tom's badge and Samuel's primers stood together, and Helen wrote it plainly. Not every loaded silence from those years ever yielded speech. 2 men who had laughed loudest in 1887 died later without apology, and Glenn noted only that their sons attended every October drill and worked without complaint. On August 14, 1899, Glenn rode Cedar no more. The old mare had stiffened through the hips and could not pull grade, so Eli and Noah retired her harness, cut her main braid, and hung it on the north wall peg above the first anchor diagram. Glenn spent that autumn teaching from a stool near the stove instead of at the trench edge, tapping barrel hoops with a hickory stick while children repeated spacing and vent rules from memory. Pike sent lamp oil each lesson night without charge and entered the tins in a new ledger column labeled School Instruction Account, publicly posted with the rest. On December 3rd, 1900, with snow beginning early and even, Glenn died before dawn in the original dugout. Bedroll set as always near the draft side. He was found by Eli at first light, one hand resting on the cover of Santa's second notebook, face calm, stove banked properly for the morning class. Coldwater buried him on the north rise above Cedar's grave and below the first rope anchor line, with Pike, Markham, Ada Hale, Noah Bright, Helen Shaw, and Eli Ryan carrying him in turns through light snow. At the grave, Eli read the lintel inscription aloud, then added one sentence of his own. He stored mercy where weather could not take it. The shelter still stands, and the rope posts still run from Church Road to the old trench bend. Each October, children move hand over hand beneath a lantern hung at the vent, names counted at start and counted again at the door. In the schoolhouse cabinet, Tom Hale's badge rests beside Samuel Bright's primers, and the register remains open to the page where Ruth Ellery, Tom Hale, Samuel Bright, Amos Dillard, and Marta Quinn were entered in Helen Shaw's script. At Pike's former counter, now run by Nora's eldest, stock boards are posted before dawn all winter long. In Coldwater, they still say Mercer tight when they mean ready, and no one says the old nickname except to teach why it failed.